Okay, so imagine a world where South Korea is actually as poor as rural Ghana, or picture China as a starving agrarian society completely stuck in the 1970s. We are so often taught that democracy is the absolute only path to prosperity, but history holds a rather dark, uncomfortable secret. Some of the most advanced, wealthy, and stable nations on Earth today didn't get there by voting. They got there through iron fists, absolute power, and the terrifying efficiency of a dictatorship. Did dictatorships build the modern world? I know. It's a super jarring question, right? When most of us see the word dictator, we instantly, and totally rightfully, think of ruin and destruction. But if we actually look at the data and study the mechanics of power, the reality is far more complex. Today, we're taking a completely impartial look at the mechanics of what we call the Playbook of Power. Because in certain desperate moments in history, this playbook has achieved things that no committee or parliament could ever dream of. We're talking about massive shifts here. Nations transforming from starving, deeply impoverished agrarian societies into advanced, high-tech, modern superpowers, often in incredibly short timeframes. Now, we aren't here to endorse these regimes, far from it. We're here to understand the raw mechanics they use to force these transformations, and why the modern landscape you live in right now might literally not exist without them. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to look at the speed of transformation, the CEO state, massive poverty reduction, order after chaos, and global standardization. And then we'll wrap up by looking at the ultimate cost of all this, the authoritarian bargain. All right, reality number one, the speed of transformation. We're looking at South Korea's laboratory. Back in 1960, South Korea was essentially a war-torn wasteland. Get this, their GDP per capita was a staggering $150. That made it legitimately one of the poorest places on the entire planet. But then, military dictator Park Chung-hee steps in. And, well, he didn't exactly sit around waiting for parliamentary consensus. He staged a coup and got right to work. He used some brutally efficient mechanics to force this transformation. First, he literally rounded up the country's wealthiest businessmen, even parading them through the streets with signs calling them corrupt pigs. Crazy, right? But he didn't just punish them. He gave them a choice: invest exactly where he told them to or lose absolutely everything. Step 2, he completely nationalized the banks, taking total control of all credit. And step 3, he handpicked specific companies, names you definitely know today, like Samsung, Hyundai, and LG, and slapped them with strict export targets. Hit the target, you get funding and protection. Miss it, the money vanishes. This absolutely wasn't a free market. It was a ruthless state-run laboratory. And mathematically speaking, it worked. GDP grew at over 8% for 3 decades. So that high-tech smartphone you might be holding right now, it exists because a military dictator forced a sugar processing company to start making semiconductor chips. Moving on to reality number 2, the CEO state. Let's talk about Singapore's corporate nation. You know, we usually think of countries as political entities. But leader Lee Kuan Yew, he treated his nation like a struggling international startup fighting for its life. In 1965, Singapore was kicked out of the Malaysian Federation, and things looked incredibly grim. They had zero natural resources, literally no drinking water of their own, no standing army, and half the population couldn't even read. The situation was so incredibly desperate that Lee Kuan Yew actually cried on national television because he genuinely believed his country was going to die. But he didn't turn to a parliament to save it. He turned to Machiavelli, and this quote brilliantly illustrates his philosophy. To build his CEO state, he did some radical things. He made English the working language just to attract global markets. He went to foreign corporate giants and basically said, hey, you want my cheap, disciplined workforce? You have to transfer your technology to us. He enforced extreme discipline, and to kill corruption, he paid his officials the highest government salaries on earth, basically making bribery completely pointless. Today, Singapore is one of the richest and least corrupt nations on the planet. He proved you could achieve Churchill-level results without actually having a democracy. Okay, reality number 3, massive poverty reduction, focusing on China's immense economic shift. If you ever want to see the most impressive scale of poverty reduction in human history, you have to look at China. By 1978, almost 90% of the country was living in extreme poverty. The previous leader, Mao, had left the economy in a total death spiral. Enter Deng Xiaoping, Now, he didn't bring democracy, but he did bring a super pragmatic philosophy he called truth from facts. He noticed this tiny village where 18 desperate farmers had secretly divided up collective land into family plots. Under the old regime, that was a crime that would have literally gotten them killed, but Deng just watched as their crop output absolutely exploded. So instead of punishing them, he took that illegal, totally capitalist model and rolled it out nationwide. The sheer scale of what happened next is almost hard to wrap your head around. 800 million. That single policy shift ultimately lifted 800 million people out of extreme poverty. To put that into perspective for you, that accounts for 75% of all global poverty reduction during that entire era. But it was a brutal deal. The people were allowed to get richer for sure, but they were not allowed to get free. That ruthless pragmatism built the world's second largest economy. Now for reality number 4, order after chaos. This is Rwanda's rebuild. The contrast here is incredibly stark. Back in 1994, Rwanda was effectively a graveyard. Nearly 1 million people were murdered in just 100 days, neighbors killing neighbors. The economy was completely non-existent. Then, Paul Kagame took over with a rebel army, and he explicitly modeled his rebuilding strategy on Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore. He abolished those horrific ethnic identity cards used during the genocide. He built these hyper-efficient systems, like a one-stop government agency where you can register a new business in literally 6 hours. And today, they boast the cleanest city in Africa and have an economy growing at about 8% a year. Now, what's really interesting here is the human impact of all this extreme order. Look at this jump. Life expectancy in Rwanda skyrocketed from just 28 years in 1994 all the way to 70 years today. He built a highly functioning state straight out of the ashes. But to be totally objective here, critics are very quick to point out that this immense order comes with a massive catch: 99% election victories and completely silenced political opposition. Moving to reality number 5, global standardization and the infrastructure of trade. It's a crazy historical paradox, honestly. Some of the most ruthless leaders in history actually birthed globalism and industrial standards. Let's walk through this timeline. Starting back in the 13th century, Genghis Khan annihilated entire cities, right? But he also basically invented the infrastructure for modern trade. He set up large-scale infrastructure standards, protected the Silk Road, and introduced universal taxation and a shared currency. It was kind of the birth of globalism. Fast forward to the 1930s and 40s. Joseph Stalin committed massive, horrific atrocities, but his brutal, rapid industrialization turned a nation of illiterate peasants into a nuclear superpower, hitting 100% literacy in the Red Army in just a few years. Yeah, they used that education for indoctrination, but the terrifying side effect was forced participation in the industrial age and global trade. Which brings us to our final reality, number 6, the authoritarian bargain, the true cost. Okay, so we've talked a lot about economic miracles, wild efficiency, and huge growth. But every single one of these transformations came with a staggering, undeniable human cost. It's all built on a very specific social contract known as the authoritarian bargain. The leader is basically telling the citizens, hey, I will give you security and wealth, but in exchange, you have to completely surrender your political voice and your freedoms to me. Because behind every shiny new bridge or that amazing 8% GDP growth stat we talked about, there are 14-hour workdays in unventilated sweatshops, and there are dissidents who are silenced or just simply disappear. So, the crucial point is summarized right here. When we study these mechanics of power, we absolutely have to weigh the tool used against the human cost. Park Chung-hee used nationalized banks, but it completely cost them the free market. Lee Kuan-yew built a brilliant CEO state, but heavily suppressed democracy. Deng Xiaoping scaled capitalism to an unprecedented level, but allowed zero political freedom. Paul Kagame brought extreme, life-saving order, but silenced all opposition. These are the objective, hard mechanics they used and the incredibly heavy price their citizens had to pay. And you know, there is an ultimate, fatal weakness to this whole strongman narrative. In today's world, democracies can sometimes feel slow, right? Or super polarized. So people look at the blazing speed of China or the pristine order of Singapore and think, I just want someone who can get things done. But history showed us over and over that these regimes are incredibly fragile. They rely entirely on the brilliance, or honestly just the luck, of a single individual. And when that leader dies or starts believing their own propaganda, the whole system often collapses into utter chaos. Just look at how violently Yugoslavia fractured and collapsed after the death of Tito. We study these playbooks not to endorse them. Definitely not. But to truly understand the raw power of focused execution. You absolutely don't need a dictatorship to build a legacy, But studying their obsession with efficiency, standardization, and technology transfer reveals exactly how our modern world was actually shaped. But it leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. We can study their raw efficiency all day long, but is the price of freedom ever really worth it? If you found this breakdown of the Playbook of Power useful, be sure to check out our other explainers on global influence. Because the world isn't always what they teach you in school. Sometimes it's a lot more interesting and a whole lot more dangerous. Thanks for learning with me today.